Hello and welcome back to A Scientist's Guide to the Gut-Brain Link. Today this is a new part of your lecture series where I'm going to introduce to you a couple of interesting topics in the hope to inspire you towards dissertation projects and so on, and hopefully integrate a more rounded part of human biology and link the brain to other areas. Today we're doing the gut-brain link and we're going to cover the microbiome, development, communication, and then some interesting parallels between the gut and the brain that aren't often talked about but are coming up as very prevalent in the scientific literature. I want to start with a couple of abbreviations as these will help you engage with the overall slides. You can look at the diagrams, pick them up a little bit quicker, and also if you nail these when you come to do your external reading through papers and stuff, you won't have to flick back through to the abstract to look at the abbreviations, as this makes reading it a little bit disjolted and a bit jarring. I want to pick out a couple that you might not have heard before. So inflammatory bowel disease, going to be quite a big topic in this. It's just chronic inflammation within the bowel, that immune response over an extended period of time, which gives you a lot of unpleasant symptoms. SCFAs, the short chain fatty acids. You probably haven't come across this before unless you've done more research on the gut. The short chain fatty acids are when you take undigestible carbohydrates and certain fibres that you can't break down yourself, and the bacteria will break these down and ferment them into short chain fatty acids. And these short chain fatty acids are very useful in the homeostasis of the gut, quite important to the maintaining mucosal layers and a healthy gut barrier. So you've got a leaky gut syndrome. That's this barrier that I just mentioned. When that's not as functioning as it should be, you've got different molecules crossing the gut you wouldn't normally, and that's going to create a bit of inflammation and a bit of a disease state. You have Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's disease, some very prevalent neurological conditions, and the blood-brain barrier at the bottom. Right, let's move on. We're going to start with a bit of a biology heavy recap of some key topics, and following on from the definitions, we're going to start with the difference between microbiome versus microbiota. These are often used interchangeably. They do have slightly different meanings. The microbiota refers to the collection of microorganisms in the specific environment, in this case being the gut, and the microbiome refers to the whole habitat. So that's the microorganisms, their genomes, and the conditions that they interact with. So microbiome is a bit more than microbiota. It includes the habitat and the genetic material as well. Let's rattle through these. I versus we. This was an interesting topic that I saw in multiple studies, and it was first referenced in Nature as I versus we. Technically, you're a symbiote, a balance and a partnership with these bacteria, and technically within your body you have roughly 10 times more bacteria than the number of human cells, and over 100 times more genetic or genomic content within the microbiome than the human genome, suggesting that we're actually more bacteria than we are human. And it was referenced in a letter to Nature, a big prolific scientific journal, that we should be referred to as we rather than I, and that just goes to show how big a part of your makeup these bacteria are. Along with the bacteria, we have archaea and we have eukarya or eukaryotic organisms. Archaea are these single-celled organisms, and they are distinct. They have a distinct domain to the bacteria. They're often found in extreme environments. So in the wild, you're thinking deep sea vents, hot springs, stuff you've probably covered in your geography. But when we come to the gut is an extreme environment. See, the stomach is very acidic, and then when you get into the large intestine, the small intestine, these are very oxygen poor environments. So these organisms aren't oxygen rich, demanding. They're more fueled by lactic acid and so on. These are the organisms that can produce methane. If you know, when cows fart, they produce that methane that goes to that global warming effect. That's because they have this sort of archaea in their gut. And we have eukarya. These can be single-celled, but these tend to be more complex, and these can be single-celled organisms like your yeast and your fungi, and then the multicellular organisms are us humans and animals. They can reproduce sexually or asexually, but that's just a quick, just needed to get that in there really, just so you know it's not just bacteria, although a lot of the emphasis is on the bacteria within the gut. What do these bacteria do really? So we can't synthesize all the vitamins we need, and some of these bacteria will help break down and synthesize certain vitamins that we need for vital processes to do with metabolism, energy production, and as these are all foreign bodies, and when you ingest food, that's a lot of foreign material going into your body, probably the biggest amount of foreign material going into your body during the day. So naturally, that's going to have an immune response, and so there's going to be a lot of immune regulation within the gut. I made this little diagram on BioRender. I just wanted to show you the parts of the digestive system. So starting with the tongue and the mouth, where you're churning up that food into more of a paste. You also have your salivary glands, so your parotid gland, your sublingual, lingual speaking, so below the tongue, then your submandibular, so your mandibular bone is this, your jawbone, so it's just under here, not particularly easy to see on the diagram. And your food's coming down the stomach, down the esophagus till it reaches your stomach, where it will go into your large intestine and your small intestine. These are all going to play different roles, such as some drugs can only be digested in the stomach, some vitamins can only be digested in the large intestine, some can only be in the small intestine. It's the group of bacteria that live in these environments that we're looking at. I thought it's also important, like anatomically, to point out that where the liver here, this structure, the pancreas, and the gallbladder, the little green structure on this diagram, just below the liver sit. As these sit here for a reason, as they play a big role within this digestive system, regulating it with hormones and being sites for very important metabolic processes. And they are in those positions for a specific reason. And sometimes when we learn biology, we sometimes separate it out to learn before integrating it back in. And it's just important to look at that system as a whole unit. In terms of metabolism, carbohydrates and amino acids can be digested into the bloodstream. Fats, we're going into the lymphatic system. So just keep that in mind. Could go into a whole video on metabolism and how that can get out of line and cause a lot of disease. But let's keep it brief and stop there. I want to preface this slide by saying I'm no embryologist and I'm no developmental biologist either. I can barely even pronounce the word. So let's follow along with this diagram. I believe the development of the microbiota that will eventually reside in your gut is very important to understanding the topic. And a lot of papers I've read have integrated at least 300, 400, 500 words into describing this, because I think it is so important. So we follow through this diagram. Actually start with the baby in the womb here, and this baby's fed by the umbilical cord from the mother, supplying those nutrients it needs to grow and develop. It's not sterile, and there's a couple of papers coming out that's disputing the fact that the gut is sterile. There are some bacteria there. However, you might as well establish this as the baseline. So you can take it as sterile. We're ignoring the bacteria that are previously there during development. Then we come to birth, and during birth, this is when a lot of the colonization to that early microbiome are formed. And in a traditional birth, the baby is exposed to the bacteria in the vaginal tract, and also some of that fecal matter that comes out when the babies are born. This exposure includes a diverse array of bacteria, including the beneficial strains such as your Bacteroides, your Bifidobacterium and your Lactobacillus. I hope I pronounced them alright, which establishes your healthy gut. So the presence of these healthy bacteria create that foundation for a healthy, strong microbiome. However, if that baby, as we mentioned earlier, is the wrong way round, or there's other birth complications, the mother may opt for a caesarean section. And during this, the babies won't be exposed to that maternal, vaginal and fecal microbiota. And the initial colonization of the gut microbiome is going to be influenced more by the hospital environment. So your healthcare providers, the bacteria in the air, the skin microbiota of the mother, and the caregivers. So the gut microbiome of caesarean-born children tend to have a lower diversity and abundance of those certain beneficial bacteria mentioned earlier, with your bifidobacterium and your lactobacillus. And they have a higher abundance of those opportunistic pathogens, which we don't really want, and they can potentially increase the risk of certain health conditions like asthma, allergies, really all those autoimmune diseases later on in life. Another key thing to mention is when the baby is first matter that it's going to consume is normally in the form of formula, the more synthetic cow-derived milk, or the early mother's milk. When it has the mother's milk, it then further increases those healthy bacteria, whether it's due to slightly different compositions in that formula, which is normally made from cow's milk. It's not specifically bad, but maybe it doesn't encourage as much of those healthy bacteria that we need. Then as you get older, so within 6 to 8 months, the baby's coming onto harder food, the microbiota will transition again to help break down that harder food. Slightly different food types, not just that lactose, sugar and etc. found in milk and all these growth hormones. Slightly different. And then as you age again and you've been eating hard food, maybe you've included more diversity, you get in your adult microbiome, and this is not as susceptible to change. It's not set, it is fluid, it can change. If you increase your fermented foods like kimchi, your kefir, yogurt, and etc., and you can get dysbiosis and disease, but the adult microbiome is not as susceptible to change as those early child's microbiomes that are originally being colonized. And that's the key facts that I want you to take away. There's things as little as the birth method and certain types of milk and produce that the babies are consuming. This is laying down the foundations of that gut microbiome and what bacteria will reside in there. Carrying on from there, I just want to mention a couple things that can change the composition again. So that's antibiotics. Antibiotics have revolutionized modern medicine, meaning far less of us are dying from deadly infections, etc. However, a lot more of us are suffering from conditions due to gut dysbiosis. So these antibiotics do kill that harmful bacteria we don't want, but they're not selective. They also are going to kill the bacteria that we do want and the bacteria that keeps our gut healthy, wiping out all types of bacteria within our gut. And then once we've got rid of that infection and we stop taking these antibiotics, certain types of bacteria, again those opportunistic pathogens, might take over, and we might get growth rates of different bacteria in higher ratios to the ones that we do want, creating a little dysbiosis and potentially a dysregulation of the types of bacteria in your gut. Fiber consumption, this will also change composition, because you've got to imagine all these microbes in your gut feed off something. So you're going to have microbes that feed off the fiber, microbes that feed off fats, sugars that you're going to get from carbohydrates. And if you eat more of one food, that say you eat more fiber, the bacteria that like living off fiber are going to be in a higher abundance, because the natural thing that they feed off is higher, they're not starving, etc. Disease can cause dysregulation of the microbiome. This can be a chicken and egg scenario, So maybe the microbiome's upset first and this causes the disease, but it also happens in the opposite direction. And stress, that chronic inflammation, the upregulated immune response, this is also going to change the composition of the gut. This is a little diagram of along the bottom these foods that are good for you, your probiotics, fermented foods. Beans on here and your whole grains. If you don't know, those are full of fibre, which is a lot of the bacteria that we want consume a lot of fibre and ferment it into those short chain fatty acids that we mentioned earlier. And the high fat, high carbohydrate stuff, the food additives, your antibiotics, your sugar, these are going to encourage bacteria we don't want and increase that immune response essentially. Most of these factors are studied in rat models, so you've got to take them with a pinch of salt, but they are very accurate to us as a species. They've been different types and composition of your gut microbiome have been studied in many different populations. So we're thinking Caucasian versus Asian versus African descent. You're going to have populations of autism, ADHD. They've compared people on different diets such as carnivore, a fibre-heavy diet typically found in vegans or vegetarians. People that have been on antibiotics, people with dementia, all these different microbiomes have been compared. And interestingly, a lot of them, people in disease states, will have greatly altered microbiomes. Another way you can change it that is going to revolutionize medicine in the future, I do believe, is the ability to transplant those healthy bacteria from a healthy individual. Just as you'd have a kidney transplant, you can now have a microbiome transplant. One of the ladies that wrote a very interesting Guardian article on this was suffering from extreme dysbiosis and extreme growth of those unhealthy bacteria, leading to her feeling nauseous, sick, losing weight, losing a lot of hair on her head, etc., and being very, very mentally unwell as well. And the only way they tried antibiotics, they tried everything, and the only way they could help her was a gut microbiome transplant, which got rid of all of those unwanted, unpleasant side effects and symptoms within 2 weeks. And within a month, it was almost as if she'd never had this specific disease, which is fascinating. Alright, that's quite enough biology for one day, I think. Now let's move on to a bit more neuroscience and explain how the brain and the gut communicate with each other. We'll start off with our parasympathetic nervous system. Many of you will know this as your rest and digest. Digest being the digestion of food. So when you're not being chased by bears and you're in that relaxed state, your body has time to process and absorb the food, take up the nutrients. Parasympathetic nervous system, in this case, hitchhikes along that vagus nerve down to the digestive tract and the gut, and this can signal digestion and various other functions. It can also take information back up about the state of the gut. Let's go over to the HPA. This is a bit more of a mouthful. The hypothalamic pituitary axis. You break it down to its three components: the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, and then the components in the blood that are signalling. The pituitary gland technically is one of the key places in the brain where that blood-brain barrier isn't as tightly regulated, so it's more of a direct contact with the blood. One of the few places in the brain where you see that. And this is so it can release hormones into the blood, those chemical messengers, and sense levels of hormones and nutrients within the blood. And so the communication is going to be done through things like insulin, your leptin and your ghrelin. And then the information is going to be received by your pituitary gland, and it's going to be relayed between your thalamus. Imagine the thalamus is basically the connection between your newer brain structures and your higher brain structures and your pituitary gland. It's just connecting them allowing you to sense that information, create a response, and relay it back through. So as we mentioned, ghrelin, this makes you hungry. In its most simple terms, it's basically your hunger hormone. Also has a lot of roles in inflammation, dampening down inflammation, autophagy, and is being seen to play a key role in dementia, and there's a lot of research going into ghrelin. You also have ghrelin blockers such as Ozempic, and these cause people to lose a lot of weight because they don't get hungry. And then on the other side of that, you have leptin. This is your satiating hormone, and this is what makes you feel full, makes you feel satisfied with that meal. Then you're going to have your insulin that's going to shut all that sugar out of your blood. You don't want sugar lying around your blood. With things like diabetes, this is what happens, and sugar can cause a lot of negative impact on your blood vessels and tissue there. So that insulin is crucial for shuttling that glucose to your muscles or the liver, where it can be used through things like the electron transport chain and just your mitochondria to create that ATP. So if you can imagine sensing nutrients like amino acids, glucose, levels of leptin and ghrelin is how your brain and your gut is going to communicate whether you've just eaten, whether you're lacking in more nutrients, etc. There's also an immune system component that helps you communicate between your brain and your gut. As I mentioned earlier, these fats are absorbed into the lymphatic system through the gut, so your gut has access to that lymphatic system. And that lymphatic system is also is very important for transporting certain cytokines and your immune cells around the body. If you've ever had an infection or a fever, you're going to get your lymph glands in your neck swollen and under your armpits, and that's your lymphatic system. Right, what else is worth mentioning? So you have your gut microbiota can produce neurotransmitters themselves. So you have this entire enteric nervous system that allows your gut to communicate with things like your skin. And on the previous diagram, I've showed you how your liver, your pancreas and your gallbladder are positioned around your stomach. So your stomach is communicating with these systems via your enteric nervous system, which some people say is like a mini brain down there with all the connections. And these bacteria that reside within your gut have the ability to produce neurotransmitters that can then correspond to a chemical response and allow that communication within these areas. A key tool in learning all of this is what can go wrong. So if we start with dysbiosis, this is what I mentioned earlier with those antibiotics. If you imagine there's almost like a Goldilocks ratio within all of the bacteria and microbes in your stomach that produces a healthy gut microbiome. If this ratio becomes uneven, so one type of bacteria grows more than the others, you can get dysbiosis, dysregulation. And this is normally the cause of things like your inflammatory bowel disease and your leaky gut disorder, the type of bacteria that you don't particularly want in your gut becoming more prevalent than other sorts of bacteria. That's it. Short chain fatty acid profiles. So you can have a more volatile short chain fatty acids and more stable ones. This isn't particularly important in the pathology of it, but remember those short chain fatty acids are when the microbes in your gut are taking that fibre and they're fermenting it to make their own food. And these like types of gut bacteria aren't bad. They can't really be classified as bad or good. But if you have too much of a certain type of short chain fatty acid, which tend to be 6 carbons long in structure, that can create unwanted side effects. The more volatile ones can create that flatulence, that gas, and unpleasant smelling gas, which can be particularly unpleasant for people experiencing like IBS and so on through sulfur compounds that they can go on to make. These are really important, and upregulation, too many of them, can result in certain metabolic syndromes and storing more fat, etc. So we get inflammation, that's the increased immune response. If we have increased inflammation, we might have certain breakdown of certain gut walls and barriers, like being attacked by that immune system, and that can create a lot of really, really nasty side effects or symptoms, essentially. You have your endotoxins and your exotoxins. This is to do with gram-negative versus gram-positive bacteria. If you remember, that gram-positive bacteria has that protein exterior that stops them from swelling up. It's basically, you have a lot of substrates in higher quantities within the cell of that bacteria, and if they didn't have this protein structure around them, they would diffuse and through osmosis leave that cell and draw a lot of water in, meaning they burst or lyse. And this is how a lot of antibiotics work, by breaking down that outer cell wall of gram-positive bacteria, creating a lysis of the cell and bursting that bacteria cell and killing it. Being gram-negative bacteria, we have multiple semi-permeable membranes, and on the outside we have these lipopolysaccharides, which are basically toxic to us, and these can cause very negative interactions with our gut barrier, and they'll trigger a massive immune response if released into the surrounding environment, which just further increases inflammation. Metabolic dysfunction. Obviously, your metabolism and the breaking down of your glucose and your fats in your stomach to create your fatty acids and your glucose for glycogenesis and whatnot, it happens in your stomach. So this is part of your metabolism, part of the breakdown of those food substrates into what you need to make energy. So any dysfunction within the stomach can cause metabolic dysfunction, because metabolism is basically the total sum of reactions within that body, but those reactions are fueled by ATP and energy. So breaking down of certain compounds into products we can use to create energy happens in the stomach, and that's how it relates to metabolic dysfunction. I just want to mention stuff to do with anxiety disorders, etc. If you remember that vagus nerve coming down towards your large and your small intestine on the inside, with your stomach and duodenum sitting on top, and this is linking back to your brain up here. So anxiety is caused by many things. It's deep rooted to your amygdala structures, etc. But on a very simple terms, it's that feeling of that fight or flight response, that uncomfortable, the feeling that you kind of want to run, you don't want to be there, you feel uncomfortable. And obviously, you want to digest when your parasympathetic nervous system is active, creating that environment that gives you that healthy digestion. So obviously your stomach and the presence of food and hormones that are released during then are going to regulate, play a role regulating, and whether that sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system is activated. For example, when you eat a load of carbs, you feel very sleepy. So if you're trying to do a deep level of work, you might avoid carbs, etc. And I think that shows you the link. So obviously, if you have a dysbiosis of bacteria and like a unregulation of those signals being sent back up into the brain, just as you can create that sleepy, calm environment, you can create that anxious, restless environment back in the brain. Don't get me wrong, this is also to do with inflammation and stuff, but on a basic level that kind of outlines how issues with your gut can lead to feelings of anxiety, that can reside with problems in your mental health. I just wanted to add that in there. It's quite a simplistic way of viewing it, but I think that really helps outline this axis, the link between your gut and your brain. Alright, now I just want to draw some parallels between the gut and the brain. I've got many of these from a paper on gut-brain psychology called Rethinking the Gut-Brain Axis within the terms of psychology. The main link to psychology being the depression and anxiety type behaviours linked to gut dysbiosis. But also, it was a great paper. It helped give me insight into many of the topics I've spoken about today. And I've just summarised a few key points from that paper and a couple others into this table that we'll just go through quickly. If you don't listen properly and you're on your phone, I don't mind. Maybe you just pick up one or two things that could be potential dissertation projects, or that you might be interested in researching yourself. Okay, if we start off with the impacts of stress, the impacts of stress are known to have very negative consequences on the brain. Things such as catecholamine release, that's going to take away that higher function thinking away from your prefrontal cortex and put it onto your deeper brain structures. You can start thinking more rationally, etc. No one feels particularly good when they're stressed, or overstressed, I should say. Some people, if you know the Yerkes-Dodson principle, will know that a healthy level of stress can be a key thing for high-level performance. And with the gut, the gut is also very susceptible to stress. So a lot of stress can lead to dysbiosis itself, with that irritable bowel syndrome and your leaky gut syndrome. It can dampen the immune response, meaning you're not getting enough immune response to infections, or it cause an over-immune response that we don't want either. And it's shown to highly change your mood regulation, essentially. Second, a bit more sciencey, is your blood-brain barrier, key in keeping large molecules and pathogens out of your brain. You also have your gut barrier, and these both have immune relevance. They both supply that barrier function, and the alteration of permeability leads to disease. Then we have neurotransmitter production. Neurotransmitters are used to communicate and respond to stimuli in the brain. They're produced by those cell bodies that are typically grouped together to make a nuclei within the brain. So you're thinking of Ralph nuclei with your serotonin, your locus coeruleus with your noradrenaline, and then substantia nigra, your dopamine. Your microbiota can also produce neurotransmitters to aid in communication as well, and respond to stimuli that it's shown in the stomach and small and large intestine, obviously. Developmental origins. So influences in early brain development and maturation through microbial colonization and immune modulation has been proven. But just as that diagram we went through earlier, taking you from that embryo all the way to an adult, in that plasticity, that change of gut microbiota over time, is very similar to the brain. Your brain's very susceptible to change and life-lasting behaviours when you're a child, and this has been shown in many different psychology books and case studies, such as orphan children in Romania that were told not to be shown love and affection, as this would make them cry out more in the night. This gave them very altered behaviours when they grew up, causing a lot of stuff like anxious attachment, and their amygdalas were shown, and hippocampus has been shown to be slightly different to people grown up in a very caring environment. Much the same with the gut. Early childhood factors, sickness, antibiotic use comes hand in hand with sickness. Different diets can play key roles in the development of both of them. Healthy mind, healthy gut, healthy mind. It's quite important growing up and the development of both of them. Both of them have crosstalk and communication. So obviously within the gut you have communication with your liver, your pancreas, even your skin, and many things. And then obviously your brain communicates with all areas of the body for coordination and just to enable life, really. Plasticity, like I mentioned in the little developmental section, you can have change to new environments, new diets, new stimuli. Are you getting too much oxygen in your stomach? Is it oxygen deprived? What bacteria are growing there? The gut microbiome, I did say it's more stable in adulthood, but it does respond to new stimuli, such as diets. Your brain's the same. Your brain thrives off plasticity and change, being able to mold to a new environment or problem solve. And that's basically your IQ, really, is your ability to change and problem solve in a dynamic environment. The change can be, in terms of plasticity in the brain, change is often very healthy, but it can be bad. And within the gut, change is not as associated with being healthy. Change is normally not a great thing in the gut unless it's unhealthy to begin with. And then I think it's quite a positive message that we can change and that your gut can mold to new environments, new stimuli. You can use diet to affect your gut if your gut isn't healthy. And I think this is quite reassuring that you have a bit of power to alter your gut and your susceptibility to disease and your ability to feel great if you just pay attention to your diet and eat great food. I think the influence on health is quite key, as both of them play a major role in mental health, particularly with those anxieties, depressions, bipolar disorders. Yeah, so there's just major mental health implications with both. Your gut has a bigger influence on things that the brain doesn't, such as metabolic health. And I feel like it's pretty much a good summary of everything that you need to know. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Have a great day.